Hey there, welcome to the first lesson in chemistry. This is Unit 1, where we are going to be studying measurement and tools of the chemist. Sounds kind of boring, but this is maybe the most important unit. This is how chemists not only take their measurements, but also how they communicate their measurements and how they account for error when they're reading each other's experiments and reading each other's data. So today we are going to ease into things. We're going to talk about experimentation. Specifically, we're going to talk about experimental variables and the difference between the independent and dependent variable when we're doing experiments. So I prompt you with the question of the day. When I'm finished reading, make sure to pause and think about it. It says, you're trying a new type of tea. When you take the first sip, you decide you don't like it and you add some milk and sugar. You take a second sip and yum, it's delicious. How can you know for sure what made the tea so great so you can do it again tomorrow? Remember to pause. So, truthfully, there's really no way to know what made the tea so delicious. It could be the milk, it could be the sugar, or it could be both. And the reason you don't know for sure is because you've added both of the ingredients to the tea before taking a sip. Had you added just the sugar, and maybe the next day you add just the milk, and then the third day you do the milk and the sugar, then you would have 3 days worth of data to determine what you actually like in your tea. I can tell you that it's very good to experiment with this kind of stuff because my husband for a very long time was drinking coffee, light and sweet. And if you ever watch the barista make a coffee light and sweet, they add a lot of sugar to it. And he liked the coffee, but realized that once he saw them making the coffee and saw how much sugar was in it, he decided that he could learn to love coffee without that much sugar in it. So this is something that you couldn't know for sure because you've added a bunch of stuff all at once. And what made it so delicious? It kind of depends. All right, to start things off, science is the description that leads to an understanding of our environment or the world around us, which includes measurements. We need to take measurements. We need measurements because it helps us to communicate with other scientists, the things that we're seeing that maybe they aren't seeing because they're not near us, with us. They might even be across the entire planet. So it's important that we take measurements to kind of ensure that everybody is understanding what's going on. If I had discovered a brand new animal, you would want to know what color it was and how big it was and maybe what it ate and how much it ate. And those are things that I would try to measure. I would say, it's orange. It's 5 feet tall. It is furry. It has polka dots. And as I'm describing this to you, you should be able to paint a picture in your head. It has 4 legs. That's even a measurement. I've counted the number of legs. Counting is a measurement. So we need measurements to help us to describe things. Because if I just told you this animal is tall, is it tall like a giraffe or is it tall like a meerkat? It kind of depends. So we have some tools in chemistry that help us to take measurements. First off is this baby right here on the left called a graduated cylinder. A graduated cylinder measures volume, and volume is the amount of space that something takes up. So this is measuring the amount of space that this water takes up. And the unit we typically use for volume in chemistry is milliliters. Occasionally we will use liters. We'll talk more about that in another video. This right here is just called graduated because each of these lines is considered a graduation. This ruler is also graduated. We don't use rulers often in chemistry, but if we do use a ruler, we're going to measure in centimeters. This right here is a digital thermometer. Notice it's measuring in Celsius. That is super important. We only measure in Celsius or Kelvin in chemistry. We do not use the Fahrenheit scale. I don't prefer digital thermometers. I don't know what it is. I prefer the classic thermometers. I prefer a classic thermometer. I don't really know why. The digital ones are typically more accurate because you don't have to read them and take a guess at the measurement. But I just like a classic thermometer. They used to be filled with mercury, but we know now that mercury causes brain damage, so we don't often use them. This one instead is filled with dyed alcohol, and in my case, it's dyed green. And this little piece on top is just a little chunk of rubber so that when I put this down on the table, this piece prevents it from rolling off the table, like your pencils may roll off the table all the time. And the way that it works is that when this bulb is in something that's hot, the alcohol that's in here expands and it climbs up the tube, and then you would read the measurement. Whoa! All good. When this bulb is in something cold, the alcohol is going to contract. So it's going to come all together, and that is going to shrink the level of the alcohol inside the thermometer, and it's going to drop down, and then we'll read the temperature. This reads in Celsius, and it reads up to 150 Celsius. Most of our tools have limits. For instance, this graduated cylinder can only measure to 100. So if I needed to measure 100 milliliters, I would measure, if I had to measure 150 milliliters, I would measure to the 100, pour this out into perhaps a beaker, and then I would measure to the 50, add that to the beaker, and then I would have 150. Can't do that with a thermometer, but you can do it with a ruler. In fact, you've probably done this with a ruler plenty of times. So if this comes up and you need more of a volume than your tool can measure, that's usually a-okay. You just kind of use the same ruler method on your graduated cylinder. Thermometers, unfortunately, don't have that capability, and neither do scales. Sometimes. It kind of depends on what you're measuring. This, it's not really a scale. It's technically called a balance. Very tiny differences. On the balance, I prefer the digital because who wants to sit there with a triple beam balance? They're not very fun or easy to use, and they take a lot of calibration. These also, in a lab setting, in a really high-tech lab where you're going to have awesome equipment, this will have a little glass plastic piece, which kind of acts like a level. If you've ever used a level to like hang a picture to tell you that your nails are going in straight and not crooked, a very high-tech balance is going to have one of those, and the bubble is supposed to sit right in the crosshairs of that level. And when that happens, it tells you that your balance is not lopsided. Your table is flat, your floor is flat, your counter's flat, whatever it is, and your balance, therefore, is calibrated. You probably don't have that on whatever balance you're using. Your kitchen balance is usually not that sensitive, although mine is. I picked it up the other day and it told me that my balance was unstable, so I couldn't use it. I had to set it down and make sure that it was not wobbly. Most often in a chemistry lab, a high school chemistry lab, or in your kitchen, you're going to have your balance reading to the tenths place. I am going to replace mine to get mine to read to the hundredths place because the more precision, the better your measurements. Some of the cheaper ones only measure to the whole number, which is not super accurate. If you're doing it just for like food or measuring, baking, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're going to do it in chemistry with some detailed experiments, you are probably going to want a balance that reads more than just to the whole number. My favorite part about the balance is the Tare button, T-A-R-E. This is super cool. Let's say that we needed 200 grams of flour for a recipe. You don't want to just dump 200 grams of flour on top of this balance because it's going to fly all over the place. The fan can, the air conditioning can kick on. Your family member walks by and creates a little gust of wind that's going to blow all of your flour all over the kitchen. Maybe you're just a mess like me. So what we can do is put a bowl on the balance and then hit the Tare button. And instead of reading the weight or the mass rather of the bowl, the Tare button makes the balance read 0. So it looks like the bowl is invisible. And then when you add flour to the bowl, you can get it to up to 200 grams. And at that point, it will only be measuring the flour. It won't be measuring the bowl. So this is really great for, number one, keeping your balance clean, especially if you're doing this, like if you were getting really specific with the types of foods you were eating and how many grams of protein you were eating in a day. If you were measuring like how many ounces of meat were going into a recipe, you don't really want to put raw meat on a scale or a balance. That can have a lot of hazards and build up a lot of germs, and that can be really yucky. If you do it on a plate, a bowl, and you hit the Tare button to make that dish look invisible, then that dish can just be washed and you don't have to worry about damaging the balance. Same thing works in chemistry. We'll do it with a beaker, and then we add some sample to a beaker, and we can make the beaker look invisible with the Tare button. Now, a lot of balances have a maximum. Usually it's 500 grams or 1,000 grams, which is a kilogram, kind of sort of like a pound. And those can sometimes be split the same way you can split a measurement on a ruler or with a graduated cylinder. If you are measuring something that you can separate, like if you were scooping in flour and you hit the maximum, you can set that aside and then do a second measurement and add the two together. Now, I'm sure you've done the scientific method over and over again every single school year, but it's fine. We're going to do a quick breeze over because you've done it a few times. Every time we are doing some type of science experiment, we're working with a hypothesis, which is an educated guess. This happens because of that. And then we're going to test it. We test it in an experiment, which is going to be organized, and we're going to write stuff down. And when we write down, and the things we write down are going to be observations and measurements. So if we go back to my new discovery of an animal, the observation is that it's orange and it has polka dots. The measurements would be that it has 4 legs and it's 5 feet tall. Counting counts as a measurement. So we're going to write all this stuff down so that we can translate it and share our information with scientists all over the world. That's kind of the point. Then we are going to take those observations and measurements, write them up into a beautiful document called a lab report, and we are going to report our results. Most of the time, our experiments are not going to become theories and laws because we're a high school chemistry class. That's not really the way that we are designed to work. But if you pursue science as a career and you are practicing this for a very long time, you could come up with a theory or a law. There's a very small difference between a theory and a law. Both of them are considered fact. A theory is words that explain a fact, and the law is the math that explains a fact. So we have the theory of gravitation, that everything attracts everything else by the force of gravity. That's a really broad brush over of it. A physics teacher could give you a far better definition, but it's just things attract to each other based on their mass. And then the law would be the universal law of gravitation, which is a mathematical equation that you can plug numbers into and effectively find out the force of gravity between two, they call them bodies. The body can be this thermometer and this pen have some amount of gravitational attraction, but it can also be them being attracted to the earth and the earth being attracted to the moon and the moon to the earth and vice versa. So that would be the law, is the math that explains what's happening. Now the question is, how do we make a good experiment? There are a few things that go into a good quality experiment. First is that we're working under controlled conditions, meaning that we're not doing this in a weird place. We're not doing it at the top of a mountain where it's windy and we can't control how much wind is blowing or temperature changes. We are going to do this in a lab setting or in your kitchen where you can control the temperature. You can control to some extent the humidity. We're not going to do an experiment and do half of it in the desert and half of it in Antarctica. That just wouldn't make sense. We want our conditions to be controlled as much as possible. Number 2, we want our experiment to be able to be duplicated or replicated. Really what this means is that if I do an experiment and I write down every little detail of what I did, I can send that to Paris, or I can send it to Tokyo, or I can send it to I can send it anywhere in the world. And as long as that scientist had the same materials that I did, then they should be able to do the same experiment and get the same results. It really comes down to me being able to write down what I did and make it super thorough so that it's easy for them to understand what I did and do the exact same thing. If you think of a recipe, it's really like that. You don't want the recipe to say, let's say we're making a cake. Mix all the ingredients and put it in the oven for 40 minutes. What order do the ingredients need to be mixed together? What temperature do I set the oven? Those are things that you would need to know in order to know how to bake the cake. So we want our experiments to be well written so that people can translate them so that they can do them at home, wherever they are in the world. Finally, number 3, predictions align with experimental results. This one is true for 99% of us. We want our results to make sense with the world around us. So really what this means is that if I predict that this pen is going to fall when I drop it, it did, that makes sense. I'm going to make a prediction and it's going to align with my experimental results. For most of us, this is true because we are doing experiments that have already been done before. We are doing experiments for us to learn. When full-time career scientists do experiments, they do it because they're trying to discover something new that has never happened before. Sometimes what they will do is replicate somebody else's experiment, learn from that, and then take it one step further and try to discover something new. For them, their predictions a lot of the time may not align with their experimental results because they are stretching boundaries. But for us, high school chemistry students, it is going to more or less align. You're going to make a prediction and it's going to make a lot of sense because we are just really starting our science careers here. So the predictions are going to make sense with what we know about the world around us. I am not going to be the 40 billionth person to drop a pen, but the first person to have their pen float away on Earth. Different things happen in outer space. So I have a practice question that we're going to run through, and we're going to find all of the variables of this experiment. So we have this experimental question: how does the amount of sugar affect student performance on a timed multiplication test? There are a few parts of this question that we are going to dissect for an experiment. First is called the independent variable, and that is the thing that we are testing. That's what we kind of want the answer to in our question. We then have the dependent variable, which is the thing that we're going to measure. In chemistry, often we're going to use some tools. In some experiments, you are going to count as your form of measurement, and in other sciences, you'll use other tools to measure. This is primarily what we use in chemistry. We're also going to have some controlled variables, which are things that we are going to hold constant for comparison. So if we're thinking back to the tea, we would want to use black tea every single day or green tea every single day. You can't just change the type of tea all of a sudden because that was not what we were testing. We were testing milk and sugar being the flavor factors in our tea. So we want to make sure that also we are drinking tea at the same temperature. We don't want to have hot tea one day and cold tea the next day because that's not what we were testing. If that's what we want to test, we can make a different experiment. But here we're testing the milk and sugar. Okay, so in this experimental question, what is the independent variable? How does the amount of sugar affect student performance on a timed multiplication test? What is the independent variable, or the thing that we test? Pause to answer. The independent variable is the amount of sugar. We are going to change the amount of sugar between the students on a timed multiplication test. Next up, what is the dependent variable, or in other words, the thing that we measure? The dependent variable, what we're measuring, is going to be the student performance or the grade that they get on the test. Now, this again, not a measurement that we're going to use a ruler or a balance for, but we're going to score the tests with an answer key and a red pen. And that counts as a measurement. As silly as that may sound, it is something that we can quantify. We're going to give them a score. It's going to be a percentage, perhaps the number correct, divided by the total number, turn that into a percent. We're going to get their score on the test. And what are some control variables? What are some of the things that we are going to hold constant so that we can compare student performance? There's a lot of things we're going to hold constant. We're going to make sure that all of the kids are being tested on the exact same question. We don't want some kids doing the 2 times tables and other kids doing the 7s. We want them to have the same amount of time to take the test. We want the sequence of the test questions to be the same. And this is something that you may not have thought of, but as a teacher, I think of a lot. There is some psychology, and I don't really understand it, but if the first test question is easy, most of the kids feel confident about the test because the first question, they're like, okay, I got this. Let's rock and roll. But if the first question stumps them and it's really tough, then it immediately just kicks them in their confidence and they're not excited for this test and they feel really demoralized. So we want to make sure that all of the kids are getting the questions in the same order. And all of the kids need to eat something. So we're going to feed them different amounts of sugar. Some kids are going to have no sugar and then a little sugar and then a lot of sugar. And those are going to have measurements, maybe, 0, 10, and 40 grams of sugar. And we are going to make sure that they have the same amount of time after they eat. So if we feed them and then they take the test in 2 minutes or they take the test in 30 minutes, it's going to matter. I'm going to run through these first 3 questions so that you can kind of figure out what you know and what you don't know. So I would take a minute to pause this and take down those first 3 questions and find the independent, the dependent, and the control variables. All right, question 1. A study was done to find if different tire treads affect the braking distance of a car. So the independent variable, the thing that we test, is going to be the tire treads. Each of the cars is going to have a different tread to the tire. The dependent variable, or the thing that we measure, is going to be the braking distance. And to do this, we would use probably a tape measure. Lastly, the controlled variables are going to be the type of car, the mass of the car, the road. You don't want to do one of these on a dirt road and one of them on a paved road. And finally, the weather conditions. Anybody who's driving knows that the road is a little slippery when it's wet and it's very slippery when it's icy or slushy. So we want to make sure that every test is done when the road is the same. It can be dry, it can be wet, it doesn't matter as long as it's the same for all of the cars. For question 2, it says the time it takes to run a mile depends on the person's running speed. The thing we're testing is their speed, and we are going to measure the time that it takes them to run. And then our control are going to be all of the conditions that we want to keep the same so that we can compare these people and their running speeds. So we want them to run the same distance. We want them to be in the same type of shoes. Nobody should be running in flip-flops and another person in, running shoes. And then we want their running conditions to be the same. We want everybody either running indoors or outdoors. And if they're outdoors, we should keep an eye on the weather conditions and the humidity and the temperature and all those. And if they're indoors, they should be on the same type of treadmill. Okay, lastly, question 3, it says the height of a tomato plant depends on the amount of water they receive. So the thing that we are testing is the amount of water. If they get a little water, a lot of water, or no water at all, we want to check on their height and their growth. So the dependent variable, what we will measure is their height, how much they grow. And again, we're going to measure that with probably a ruler. We're going to measure in centimeters. And then the controls are sunlight, the quality of the soil. We want them to be the same type of tomato plant. There's so many types of tomatoes. So we want to make sure that they're the same type of tomato plant. And we want to grow them in the same season. We don't want to grow some in the spring and others in the fall. We want everything to be the same across the board, aside from the water. This ensures that water explains the difference in height. Water is the only explanation for a difference in height. And that is where the independent and the dependent variable, and that is where the controls come in clutch. They're super important. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thank you for learning independent and dependent variables. Feel free to drop any of your questions in the comments section. Subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's lesson, and I'll see you there. Bye.